The politics in America are complicated. This episode is not a partisan piece on who's right and who's wrong. In this day, the majority of us have pretty much made up our mind about that. The mission of Old Cove Road is to explore how social media is affecting our mental health and our sense of community. In prior episodes, we've talked about how the idea of community has changed. Today's episode will consider how social media has changed politics, how we consume news, and how we view each other. My name is Chris Morandi, and this is Old Cove Road.
If I told you what I'm really thinking, you wouldn't listen for long. Yeah, you'd ask me if I'd been drinking. No, I tell you, you couldn't be more wrong.
So there's a lot to cover when talking politics and social media. So let's start with some basics. I came across an article by Dr. Joel Penny, professor at the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. The article was entitled Social Media and Citizen Participation in Both Official and Unofficial Electoral Promotion. In the article, Dr. Penny analyzes the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign. Here's Dr. Penny.
Well, actually, I started looking at political expression offline, and I kind of migrated to online because I saw that the connections were so important. I did actually a dissertation in graduate school about people wearing political messages on their T-shirts. Oh. And from there, it was a really interesting area of research. People hadn't really looked at it before. But as I was doing that, I really became more interested in the way in which people use a variety of different platforms kind of as their soapbox or little ways in which to contribute or participate in the broader, media conversation and political conversation. So some of the same things I was seeing on T-shirts were showing up as profile pictures and memes and, vice versa. And so from there, I have done, a lot of research for the last number of years on grassroots political expression at the citizen level. I've been particularly interested in political movements and campaigns. Sometimes this is sort of official politics. Sometimes it's, more social movements. But I was really interested in the kind of word-of-mouth promotion, or what they call electronic word-of-mouth promotion that's been happening around these kinds of movements, for lack of a better word. Mm-hmm. So the Bernie Sanders campaign, became interesting to me because it seemed as though that social media was really driving the interest in the candidate, that people were finding out about this through social media, that he was, in a sense, leading a social media movement. And it was really interesting in terms of social media as an alternative, grassroots kind of platform for people to, raise issues that maybe were not being raised in mainstream news or journalistic coverage. That was a big, story of that campaign, was that the Sanders folks, they weren't getting a lot of coverage by mainstream journalists, but they were building a lot of kind of grassroots momentum and support on the internet. And that did seem to have a big impact. It certainly surprised a lot of people that the campaign went as far as it did, considering how kind of obscure Bernie Sanders was at the beginning of that race. Certainly, when he entered it, he was something like 60 points behind or 50 points behind Hillary Clinton. And by the end of the race, they had almost pulled even with each other. So that's a hugely dramatic narrative, even though, of course, he lost the election. It does fit into a broader pattern that we've seen, even going back to the Obama campaigns a bit. Mm-hmm. But there's been certainly examples of this around the world in many cases where you're seeing these kinds of grassroots movements take off on social media, and they're really kind of upending the traditional model of politics and power.
Yeah. So in studying the Sanders campaign, what were some of your takeaways?
Well, in that study, I actually was taking a different approach than what I've done in the past. I often, talk to sort of everyday people, as we can call it, internet users, the kind of folks who are sharing, kind of promotional messages, whether there be memes or viral videos or hashtags, or in the case of the Sanders campaign, it was, hashtag Feel the Burn.
Right.
But for the study that you're talking about, I actually went to the other side of things and started talking to the folks who were organizing these campaigns. And actually, in that case, what was really interesting was that it was not just the official campaign organization, every campaign has, their official, communication wing where they're putting out promotional, media content and trying to promote the campaign.
Right.
The Sanders campaign was very interesting because there was this independent grassroots group that was kind of working with them. It was called the People for Bernie Sanders. And it was actually not officially part of the campaign at all, but they were kind of working with the campaign. And it was a very interesting new model because I don't think we've really seen, that kind of, certainly there's a lot of grassroots stuff going on, but to reach the level of where they were really organizing a kind of, one person called it the official, unofficial part of the campaign. And then even beyond that, I actually was looking at fully grassroots kinds of, I would really think of it in terms of promoting the campaign, but completely outside of the norms of, not just the official Sanders campaign, but even the People for Bernie Sanders. I'm talking about specifically, I researched this group called the Bernie Sanders Dank Meme Stash, which was on Facebook. And this was, kind of mostly younger people sharing, pro-Bernie memes. Sometimes it got, into other kinds of content as well. And again, it like a lot of other case studies that we've seen, we're looking at a more kind of participatory model of campaigning and activism and what really, what it is to me, which is political advertising. When somebody shares a funny Bernie Sanders meme on Facebook, on one of these groups that I'm mentioning, it's funny, it's a laugh, it's something that people enjoy. Maybe the like-minded folks kind of get a kick out of it. But what we're really doing here, if you look at this from the perspective of what's called, again, electronic word of mouth, is that these are functioning as political ads. And so, and unpaid, right? Grassroots, voluntary people doing this of their own accord.
Right.
So we're really kind of looking at a totally new model, or certainly a revival of the sense of politics from the grassroots, of people, again, intervening in the media landscape and taking, upon themselves to, in this case, promote a candidate who a lot of people hadn't heard of before. And by the end of it, a lot of people had, because of those shares, those likes, those comments on the internet.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. What made the Sanders campaign unique in terms of social media use in politics?
Oh, it's certainly not unique to the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. I mean, you can draw a lot of parallels. On some level, some of the support around Trump looked like this, even though it was often from folks who were maybe towards the left. Were really horrified at what's now called the alt-right.
Right.
Some of the like Pepe the Frog memes that were going around. I mean, that stuff has been happening on the right as well as the left. Some of the biggest comparisons that you can make in American politics to Bernie might be the Ron Paul campaigns of the last few elections. So we're really not talking about just one person or even just one kind of politics. But the theme, I think, that ties together these examples is, outsiders or people who are kind of coming outside of the mainstream. Now with Trump, it could be argued whether that campaign was really an outsider campaign, although he was sort of labeled as such.
Right.
Certainly, when we're kind of looking at the broader picture here, we can see that, again, social media is giving people a voice or giving an opportunity for ideas and perspectives to be heard that were simply not part of the sort of top-down mainstream news media or political media of the past. Things like the broadcast television channels, or even cable television, and of course things like urban newspapers. Social media kind of opens the floodgates to these sort of outside of the mainstream opinions and sometimes candidates. That could be, in the case of Bernie Sanders, a socialist, somebody who was, pretty remarkable in American politics for actually labeling himself a socialist, in a context where that still has such a stigma attached for some people.
Right.
But that was certainly outside of the mainstream. And, at the same time, we're talking about the rise of hate groups and white supremacist groups, and some of that was circling around the Trump campaign. Those are certainly outsiders as well, and they found a voice on social media as well to quite a powerful effect. Again, it doesn't really just go one way in terms of an ideology or politics. We're opening up the floodgates on social media to all kinds of sometimes extremes, sometimes alternative kinds of ideas. And, depending on your position in that, you could see positives as well as negatives.
So with these movements becoming more prevalent and more accessible through social media, how does the candidates' responsiveness to the online movements affect their popularity and ultimately their chances of winning?
Yeah, I mean, those relationships are becoming important, and that was something I looked at in that Bernie Sanders study. There was some back and forth between the grassroots and the sort of the official voice, although there was also some tension, interestingly. That was one of the most interesting findings from the interviews that I conducted. I was talking to basically the person who was running the digital strategy, for the official Bernie Sanders campaign, and he said Bernie Sanders himself didn't like #FeelTheBurn, at least at first. He thought that it was too silly, that it wasn't substantive enough. It didn't really talk about any issues. If you see him talk, in his speeches, he's, very, very on topic, very on the issues, always trying to get things back to the issues that he's sort of passionate about. So the idea that you have this catchy slogan in hashtag form that was just kind of a pop culture joke, right? It's about, feel the burn like an old 80s exercise videotape.
Right.
It didn't really fit in with his style of political communication, but that was kind of interesting about it, is that it formed a kind of, as I talk about in the study, a kind of multi-layered kind of environment or ecology. So you have, Bernie himself, if you look at his Twitter, it's all about income inequality and, tax reform and or things like this, issues, policies. And then you go to the grassroots people and they've got memes where, Bernie Sanders is like a cool, pop culture hero, or, hashtag feel the burn, again, this kind of pop culture reference.
Right.
And so what they're doing is they're kind of filling in some of the gaps, at least, and that was actually something that this person who I had interviewed from the campaign itself, he readily admitted. He said that, these grassroots groups, even though some of them we were kind of holding at arm's length because, the tone maybe, I mean, the Bernie Sanders tanked meme stash, half of it was, jokes about marijuana, actually.
Right.
So, they don't necessarily want to bring these folks into the tent so much, but they understand that they're serving a function or serving a purpose. And so, a candidate would be wise to sort of at least, understand the role that this kind of expression plays. And even sometimes they said that, eventually they came to embrace hashtag feel the burn. They included it in some of their official messaging. So they kind of got the message. If you examine the Hillary Clinton campaign, something similar was going on there. They tried out a lot of different messaging strategies. And I believe they eventually went with hashtag I'm with her.
Right. That
was the sort of the biggest one towards the end, at least. And I read some interesting reporting. At least this is journalistic reporting. I don't, academics could confirm this, but just to say that they tried out a lot of stuff and they were sort of crowdsourcing it. They would look at what people were responding to, and they saw a lot at the grassroots level. A lot of the Hillary supporters were really liking this hashtag I'm with her. So in response, they kind of bumped it up as their more official campaign slogan. And again, they were kind of responsive to the grassroots. I can think of an example in the past of a similar one. If you recall, in 2008, when Obama was running for president for the first time, one of the most iconic images of that campaign was that portrait of Obama with red and blue colors. Yeah. It was created by the artist Shepard Fairey, and it said hope, right? Now, that was totally outside of the Obama campaign. Shepard Fairey did that as a activist, as a sort of a citizen on his own accord, but it became so successful, on T-shirts, actually, going back to what I was talking about before. It was a very popular T-shirt. It was also a very popular profile picture on social media, an image, a meme that was going around and endlessly being remixed online. Right. And because of that, they eventually, I think, hired Shepard Fairey to do some of their, campaign graphics and messaging. They kind of embraced it. So that kind of that kind of relationship is increasingly common, and it's certainly wise to be listening to your own supporters and the grassroots activists and trying to build a message around that.
Yeah, so we've talked about how ordinary people and folks not directly affiliated with campaigns can have more influence thanks to social media. But what do you make of the general political landscape now? It seems like we hear a lot from campaigns, from candidates, from politicians themselves through social media, most notably President Trump and his Twitter account. Is the marriage of social media and politics a good thing?
Yeah, and of course, it really does put these social media companies in a new and probably for them uncomfortable position. Facebook and Zuckerberg, have gotten a lot of heat about, how they handled, for instance, paid political advertising, which you're referring to, or, simply, false fake news stuff, not labeling it or not having a way to kind of let people know where it was even coming from. We're, the landscape now is, there's potentially big changes. The internet and social media is still relatively new historically. And we're kind of at a period now, like where we were in the early days of broadcasting, where, there was a lot of unanticipated and sometimes very powerful effects of these new tools and people who have been figuring them out, and that we're having this reaction now. It reminds me a lot of where we were, after the World Wars in terms of fear of broadcasting propaganda. Now we're kind of fearing we're fearing propaganda on social media instead, and that could lead to big changes. I mean, the whole regulation of broadcasting in our country, including the FCC and the licenses and everything like that we've had for many, many years, that did come out of the political context of its time. The internet, of course, is, by contrast, far less regulated. It really is still this Wild West. And the question is now, you're hearing about, for instance, changes in policies, or Facebook is going to, change how they take paid political advertising, or at least how they report it. The big change that they can make, at least comfortably, is the transparency issue. Labeling content, saying where it came from, maybe flagging it if people, are trying to flag false or fake misinformation, right?
Right.
Of course, the more bigger threat is, could this actually lead to a push for internet censorship? And I do think that's very dangerous, actually. And many internet kind of writers and authors and researchers are kind of sounding this note as of late, that by hauling Facebook and Twitter into Congress and kind of shaming them for carrying misinformation, the question is, well, what are they going to do? Are they going to create a ministry of truth at Facebook? Do we really want Facebook to be deciding what's a true article or what's not, or the threat of like blocking certain kinds of posts because they're deemed false? I mean, you could see that just opens up the floodgates to giving these companies far more power. So really, we're now seeing this very important historical moment where we now understand the extraordinary potential of these companies like Facebook or Twitter to act as these gatekeepers of information, political discourse, and we might see some changes.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating topic, and one that I think we're only beginning to understand. Dr. Joel Penny, thank you so much for coming on Old Cove Road.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell people where they can find your work.
The biggest thing I've got right now, my first book is out. It's available from Oxford University Press. It's called The Citizen Marketer. Subtitle is Promoting Political Opinion in the Social Media Age. So you can find that from the Oxford University Press website. My Twitter is @ProfessorPenny. I've got actually a website that goes along with the book called www.citizenmarketer.org. So you can check that as well for information about the book or other stuff that I'm up to.
So social media has certainly changed the landscape of politics, but has it changed us? One of the common criticisms of social media is that it makes us more polarized, walled off, and tribal. On the surface, at least, this seems to be true about how we engage in political conversation today. Are we actually more polarized, though, or has this always been the reason why we're not supposed to talk politics in public? Anton Goldwasser, a doctoral candidate at Yale University, set out to answer this question. Anton published his findings in an article entitled Social Media Use Relates to Perceiving the U.S. as More Politically Polarized. Here's Anton.
And yeah, so I noticed when I was going through a number of studies that people have looked a lot less at perceived polarization instead of actual polarization, and thought that maybe, it's an interesting dichotomy, right? Because you kind of have this idea for like echo chambers, for example, right? You have this idea that like echo chambers online, right? You start to talk more with people who are like you. Does that actually lead you to think that society is more politically polarized or not, right? Because if you see all the people that say things that are similar to what you're saying, maybe that should make you think everyone just thinks that, and then it's not really polarized anymore, right? Because everyone's kind of on your side. And like, where are the other people saying anything that contradicts this? Like, I don't know, they're not there, so it must mean that it's not that polarized. But it turns out that that's probably not the case.
Yeah, interesting. So tell me about your study.
Okay, so basically what we did, it's really quite simple. So we looked at how much time people spend on social media. So we included Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And we correlated, so just a relationship, the amount of time spent on social media with how politically polarized they see the United States, and specifically really in terms of like Democrat versus Republican. It turns out there is a relationship. It's not huge, as one would expect, right? There's hundreds of other variables interacting, doing other things there. But there is a relationship, and it remains when you control for a number of other variables. I wish we'd included more, but since I did it quickly, we included, I think, age and education and political orientation. That one's very important, obviously. But I wish we'd included a couple more variables. But even when controlling for those variables, right, so it's like you account for those variables, you still find this relationship actually stays exactly the same or goes a tiny bit up, actually. So there does seem to be some relationship between spending time on social media and perceiving the United States as polarized. Again, these are American participants, right? And also this doesn't seem to relate to what your goal is of being on social media. So do you use it for gathering information, and sharing information, or do you use it for, friends? Is it purely social, or is it more, I guess gathering and sharing information would be also a little bit more news tendency. And it turns out that the extent you spend time on social media to either socialize or gather information doesn't actually relate to the perceived politicization of America. So whatever you're spending, like whatever your goal is on social media, whatever you're actually doing on it, doesn't really seem to matter. It just seems to matter that you're on it for the relationship with perceiving the United States as polarized.
Oh, interesting. So the take-home message is the more time you spend on social media, the more polarized you think we are politically in the United States. It seems a bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy, though. So the more you're engaged with politics and the more that engagement is talking about how polarized we are, the more polarized we think we are. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it seems a little frustrating. Is this kind of frustration part of the motivation for your study?
Partially. So there is something about that. So one thing that I find absolutely fascinating, and I think I mentioned it in the discussion of the paper, is that polarized content gets more airtime, right? So if you watch CNN, you're going to see, Billy on one side, who's rather extreme, and Bobby on the other side, who's rather extreme on, the left or the right? They're going to be conflicting but extreme opinions. CNN never said, let's get the moderate to sit in and tell us how everything's okay and that actually we should be more moderate, right? It's not captivating. Nobody will watch it. They'll just turn off the TV if there's nothing exciting, quote unquote, going on, right? There's a shock factor. Somebody says, we're going to build a wall. You're like, oh, wow. And everybody pays attention. If somebody comes and says, well, we should really consider immigration from all the different nuanced standpoints, you'd be like, right, you're falling asleep. Right. And that's the problem, right? That there's this, I think there's a slight conflict in the idea that media outlets need to produce, and I understand that. But at the same time, that leads, at least to a certain extent, I think, to these extreme judgments, these extreme opinions, which is really unfortunate because you're sitting there saying, wow, we're really in a crisis right now, right? We're really in this problem where everyone's yelling at each other and everyone's divisive, when that really isn't actually the case. And in the discussion, I cite an article that shows that. So people are wildly inaccurate in how they perceive the United States in terms of political polarization. People think it's insanely politically polarized, but that's not actually the case at all.
Yeah. So how do we get here?
It really is a cycle, right? Once you say something divisive to try and get attention, right? Mm-hmm. Then the divisive becomes more normalized. So the next time you have to do something more divisive. And so it just keeps going. And it's just a function of our psychology, right? We pay attention to things that are shocking. Yeah, and we like to watch things where there's competition, where there's a fight between two groups, right? We want to watch tennis between one person and the other. We don't want to watch them shake hands and chill in the middle, right? Like, that's boring. So it definitely is a function of our psychology that we pay attention to these things. I mean, this is why propaganda works, right? Apart from fear and all those other things. So yeah, definitely a chicken or the egg, but it really is a cycle. And the problem with the cycle is that the shock factor becomes normalized, and then you have to just keep being more polarized as far as presentation is concerned. And then at a certain point, right, it either boils over or there's a kind of like counterculture where it goes back to the moderate. And we've seen this in like historically and politically many, many times, right?
So you said it's just, it may be just our perceptions of things. What do you think about changing perceptions?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that would be good. I mean, one great way to do that would be to make it more salient, more relevant, more common that we see moderates' opinions. And this goes back to kind of news media and all this kind of stuff, right? If you in psychology, if you see things over and over and over again, you take them to be as more fluent, and that means you take them to be as more true. So if you see polarized opinions over and over and over again, you take that to be as the truth. That is how things are, that is fluent, and therefore that must be true. It's just a repetition. So if in your worldview, if in you walking around in the world, you don't see moderates and you don't see people working together, you will assume that doesn't exist because it's not fluent. It goes against what you keep seeing. And so this is just interesting because you kind of have this idea where if you're paying more attention to the news media than you are to potentially the people around you physically in the town you live, in the city you live, right? Mm-hmm. Then you might start to experience political polarization as more fluent, and you assume that that's true. And so a good exercise might be to just turn off the news for a week, see if you actually change, right? I think that would be an amazing study to do. Maybe somebody has. But yeah, that absolutely would turn it off, right? Just to qualify, right? Like when I'm talking about the article we did, the most likely mechanism at play here is that being on social media, you come across political news shared by your friends, an article, something like that, right? And that's why it's related to increased perceived political polarization.
So maybe we've always seen ourselves as polarized. Maybe not talking about politics in public allows us to express commonality and talk about ideas that we share. On social media, expressing ideas without regard for other viewpoints and people's thoughts and feelings is easy. Like many other aspects of our lives, maybe social media creates the shield necessary to express strong and sometimes radical ideas. As Anton talks about, the more polarized we think we are, the more we view things as us versus them. Can social media become a platform for civilly and thoughtfully discussing ideas and solutions? Or are we just too far gone?